You talk about how effectively you got to about the age of 20 without really listening to pop music. And then, in fact, the first records you say you bought were Pere Ubu and Sonic Youth.
Yeah.
And all these things seem really important, but also what seems really important is the fact that it was Pere Ubu and Sonic Youth. That's an important filter and an important lens, in a way, for how you then started to deal with classical music, that you'd found in pop music sound and noise and power that probably a lot of people who stay within classical music are surprised exists. And
Absolutely.
you found it at an interesting age, and it seems to have had a big effect on how you've ended up writing about classical music.
Yeah, I mean, of course, first of all, it changed, my whole perspective on the musical world in general, because finally, at that very late age, I started to discover pop music, and this was my entry point, was the sort of the very kind of noisy end of underground rock. I began, I think, to pay more attention to these more unruly forces in classical tradition. It's rather obvious in the case of a lot of 20th century music, less so, I think, in the case of early music, but it's certainly there in Beethoven and Mahler, and it's important to point out that I think, especially in the age in which that music was written, the idea was not to create a sort of a sublime and orderly picture of civilized life. I mean, these were composers grappling with all kinds of forces and with violence and disorder,
Yes.
and sort of trying to unleash something that had been contained. And I think that's very, very crucial to Beethoven's music in particular. So in a way, I retrospectively went back and rediscovered that element. This odd kind of border crossing in the world of alternative music and sort of underground music and the avant-garde. This can also be a point of entry for people who grew up with pop music and are now ready to discover classical music, but maybe if they sit down and listen to a Mozart string quartet, they'll be like, I don't know. But if they listen to John Cage or Stockhausen or Steve Reich or Arvo Pärt, this may be a much better place for them to begin.
Was there a moment when you were developing yourself as a writer about classical music per se, that music, that the fact that you were interested in pop music and wrote about that as well, and forms of popular culture, was there a form of suspicion within the classical music community?
When I wrote my first big pieces for the New Yorker on, I wrote a sort of shorter piece on Pavement and Sonic Youth, and then the longer pieces on Dylan and Radiohead, there was some alarm, because a lot of people in the classical world, first of all, they do have that old attitude of everything that's not classical music is rubbish. Sort of a dwindling number of people who really have that idea, but they're still there. And also this like a sense of a culture war. Any space devoted to pop music is space taken away from classical music. So I think they felt, well, if I'm sort of expending these precious words on Bob Dylan, it's a waste. I could be writing about classical music. But especially when I wrote about Björk and Radiohead, I very consciously inserted references to classical music, to those artists' favorite composers, Messiaen, John Cage, and so forth, with the idea of planting seeds in people's minds, and the idea that sort of fans of their work might sort of develop an interest in classical music as well. And it wasn't the major reason that I wrote those pieces. It was, first of all, just because I believed in the music. That was certainly at the back of my mind. The Bob Dylan piece was different, because there's really no classical connection here at all. I didn't try to talk to him, of course. I was just observing as a fan. But that was a strange and singular experience, because I really was writing as a fan there, and it was out of an obsession.
You actually talk about the music, not the words, and you say in the piece about how a lot of rock critics they do tend to pay attention to words in rock music, often I think overestimating their importance. But you make some comments on the musical quality of Dylan. So you slip that in. You slip in some fantastic references to classical history with what Dylan's doing. Yeah. You came in from just a slightly different point of view, didn't you?
Yeah, or just how words and music are woven together and how they reflect each other. And with Dylan, I just think there's really no difference. I think he thinks in terms of words and music simultaneously, and it comes out of him. Those forces are so intertwined, and actually compared him to Wagner, which is sort of a bizarre reference to make, but Wagner was another case of an artist who had this very powerful musical sensibility, but also his literary self, and either one of them on its own was lacking in some ways. He couldn't really sit down and write a four-movement symphony, or he didn't try to do so as a mature composer. And when you just look at the words on the page, it's kind of I don't know. But when you bring it all together, then something very potent is unleashed, and the same thing happens with Dylan.
The way you write about Dylan then, confirms and sort of sanctions that elevation of someone like Dylan into a mighty historical figure.
Which he is.
Which he is, but it refreshes both sides. It says to those people that have remained very much within the classical world and have neglected these mighty figures that have come in different ways, but they might be as intrigued by, as they are by the figures they appear to be intrigued on in this world.
Both Dylan and Wagner, everyone agreed that these absolute world-changing forces, everyone had to have an opinion, everyone had to contend with this music. Absolutely no one could agree on what it actually meant. And, Wagner was embraced by fascists as well as communists and feminists and gay rights people, and it's all across the board. And in the same way, Dylan has been interpreted into oblivion, and yet he's still there and still has that kind of mysterious concrete meaning for new generations of listeners coming along.
And a great task for a critic to keep working away at the meaning and the sense and get their own perspective on it. What you've made clear is that some figures just because they come from the 17th, 18th, 19th century or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where they're stuck and that they're from the past. You sort of liberate their minds, you liberate their intellect, and almost sort of give us a feeling of what it would be like if they were around now, what kind of figures they would be like now, rather than the way that they've been kind of calcified within these rituals and the sort of the dressing up and the whole sort of reducing of it to the status quo, if you like, when a lot of it is about dissent.
Writing about Mozart and Schubert in this book, I did try to imagine to some extent, what these people might have been like, and always sticking to the historical record and acknowledging the limitations of what we really know, but nonetheless engaging in a bit of speculation of what it might have been like to spend an hour with Schubert or Mozart. If we limit sort of our whole understanding of Bach, to the sort of smattering of data that we have in his daily life, most of it very humdrum and boring, we come out with a picture of a very sort of dry and distant person. But we know he must have been so much richer and more human than that. We just don't know what kind of person really. This applies even more to performances. The need, especially in sort of 17th, 18th century music, to look beyond the notes that are simply printed on the page, because performance practice in those days gave much more latitude toward the performing musician than we're accustomed to today. You were supposed to improvise a bit and sort of add your own flavor, and so it was a great mistake for a long time in the performance of this music to just play the notes on the page and nothing but, because paradoxically you will give an inauthentic performance if that's all you do, because that's just not the way the music was performed.
What about the role of the critic? I mean, what's ironic about your flowering, if you like, as a notable and noted critic, is that it's at the time when the critic, to an extent, is being replaced by a collective wisdom, if you like, by the guidances of everyone.
Crowdsourcing and all that. Crowdsourcing.
Yeah, the people grading and rating, and some of the context and perspective that we'd like to think a critic might bring to it, desperately holding on to the notion there's still a value. But you've actually proved that people still respect the critic, still want the critic, and that they still want some kind of judgment from above the babble, if you like.
Well, hopefully, yeah, and I think actually there's room, for all of this, we obviously have this new internet world where everyone can have a voice and rate music and write about music on blogs and so on and so forth. But I don't think that necessarily should push aside the voices of professional critics who do this for a living. The crisis is really more an economic crisis with newspapers, with magazines, with the publications that have kept, those of us who are critics in business, and sort of they have these sort of structural reasons why they're sort of doing not so well at the moment. But I'm grateful to say that the New Yorker is sort of in pretty good shape at this point, and is absolutely committed to sustaining its staff of critics and of the tradition of long-form writing. And I can tell you, it just makes all the difference in the world to have this extra space in which to express myself and just.
Well, that seems to be the key, doesn't it? Because what came with the internet, oddly enough, with all the space, is that everything got more and more reduced, and the development of an argument, the development of an idea seems to have been ignored. Whereas you would have hoped that it would open it up, wouldn't you?
Well, of course there are. I mean, you can find sort of 20,000 word essays on the internet, but not a lot of people read them. And I think if there is, if I can just sort of be curmudgeonly for a moment and just sort of spell out kind of one issue that I have with the internet, it is what it does to reading habits, that sort of people really focus on what's right on the square screen in front of them and have difficulty reading beyond that and sort of seeing a sentence within the context of a larger argument, and the culture of distraction where there's always a link waiting to take you away from one piece into another. And I really think this has done some damage to how people read, and I just speak from experience. I find myself constantly distracted in this way, but the New Yorker at least is, and I think there are other magazines this is true of as well, people still like to sit down with the printed publication and read the old-fashioned way and follow someone's argument from beginning to end.
It's almost the voice of God nature of the critic, that the collective democratization of the internet is railing against. Who are you to decide? Why should you? But on the other hand, I think that level of hierarchy has an important role to play, that there are people who say, no, I do believe this, and I will change your mind, and I do think it's important that I do.
Well, one thing I do think about is I don't want to be passive, and just because Carnegie Hall or sort of Lincoln Center, some big institution in New York, has decided that X is important and is sort of filling the airwaves with whatever it is they're promoting, that doesn't mean that I have to go along with it, and I sometimes really do choose to ignore what everyone else is talking about, and instead focus on something that seems much more on the margin, just because I feel that there's some justice in that, me speaking up for an artist who might otherwise go neglected, and then just kind of banging my fist on the table sometimes and saying, we must be paying more attention to contemporary composers. It's a message that a lot of people don't want to hear, frankly. They would just rather keep going back to their beloved Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms. And I just have kept pushing at it because I feel that there's actually something really deeply wrong with an artistic world that is not paying attention to its living artists. It's really quite perverse, and so I'm happy to say I think the situation has sort of started to correct itself a little bit, even in America, which is more conservative in this way than Britain in a lot of ways.
It was interesting how much pop music was taking directly and indirectly from the classical history, all the way up to ambience, beyond ambience, and post-middleism, and yet the classical was not looking into pop. I mean, even recently, I've been talking to young composers. It is amazing how narrow their knowledge of the intelligent pop repertoire is, which is fascinating, really, because you would have felt that would be where they would be looking to refresh their own history and not be so intimidated by all these major figures, which I think is another reason why classical music kind of gets itself in cul-de-sacs. There's all these mighty monolithic figures behind them, and where do they go within it? Oddly enough, over there on the other shores in the intelligent area of pop, there were clues about where they might go.
Yeah. I mean, my definition of a composer is someone who listens to everything and reacts to the entire spectrum of music that exists. This is what Mozart did, and this is what Beethoven did. They weren't just listening to sort of the very kind of highest rank of courtly music. I mean, they were also listening to the music of the streets and engaging with it, and they wanted to have a complete picture. And this is what composers do. They feed off of the music that is out there. And you do have a lot of people coming out of conservatories that have a much narrower musical worldview. But again, I think that's changing, and I do encounter young composers who are actually very well versed in hip hop or sort of electronic.
But it's interesting with a lot of musicians, say, some of the European musicians, Icelandic musicians, the Ben Frost, the Johan Johansson. It's interesting that if their music was filed under classical music, it would have a completely different kind of a response to it.
There's this new world of pretty much unclassifiable music. That sort of, it could be classical music, it could be pop, and sometimes it's made by an artist who grew up in the pop world, who has now developed an interest in the classical field. Sometimes it's vice versa, and these careers are just sort of intersecting and overlapping. But it's actually happened before. I mean, sort of something the same thing was happening in downtown New York in the 60s and 70s, where people from very different traditions were congregating and all starting to sort of make the same music together that didn't really belong in any category. So I think it's cyclical.
And do you think ultimately you have a great faith in the genius of the listener? Because as much as there's been Dylan and Wagner and Shostakovich and Sibelius and Britten and Pavement or whatever, what it takes ultimately is listeners to be as much a genius, if you like, as the musicians to get it.
Oh, sure,
and it seems to be something that's underestimated in the commercial world. Just giving them pap. The idea that you actually say no, that the ultimate listener is it themselves a genius, and we must pay attention to.
I think so, yeah. And obviously there's a lot of rubbish that becomes sort of momentarily popular and disappears, but also sort of the great crowd of listeners out there can sometimes be absolutely right and recognize something that the sort of the intellectual sphere may not be paying attention to. Britten is actually a case where a lot of people sort of early in Britten's career said, oh, he's very clever, he's very brilliant, but he's not really a major composer. But when sort of early audiences heard Peter Grimes, they knew something absolutely immense, was in front of them, and sort of Britten's career took off from there. And so there are sort of many cases of that where instinctively an audience latches on to a creative personality actually in advance of the sort of critical class and intellectual class.
Alex, thanks ever so much indeed for your time.
Sure.
It's been really great.
Thank you, Paul. It's
Thank
wonderful.
You.